Okay, so we're recording now. I'm really so thrilled to welcome my friend and co-worker Alexei Kochetov to La Trobe to give us this talk today. Alexei first visited us, I think it was 2016. I'm sorry, I didn't check the date. It was 2016, okay. As part of the now defunct, I'm sorry to say, Visiting Scholar Scheme, which we loved. So I've got his CV up here. Alexei did his undergraduate degree in English language, linguistics and literature at Perm University in Russia. And after that, he went to the US, to Pittsburgh State University, where he did his MA. And eventually he did his PhD at the University of Toronto in Canada, where he is now. His thesis was The Production, Perception and Emergent Phonotactic Patterns, a case of contrastive palatalization. And so he certainly established his reputation through his work on palatalization. Oops, I hope everyone's, okay, Stephen, can you monitor the chat? After he finished his PhD, he spent a few years at Simon Fraser University, but before moving back eventually to the University of Toronto. If I were to read through all of his publications, I mean, they're extremely impressive in all sorts of very high quality outlets. So I've highlighted, you know, I don't know, probably a dozen different publications, different outlets, but there's a very, very long list. But suffice to say perhaps that at the moment, he is associate editor at Phonetica and also associate editor at the Journal of the International Phonetic Association. So he's also a council member of the International Phonetic Association and also a councillor of the Association for Laboratory Phonology. I won't say too much more, and it's all just, you know, a very, very long and impressive CV. We're really looking forward to hearing more about his work on Kalasha. So I hope I said that properly. If I didn't, he'll correct me, and I'll be quiet now and just hand over to Alexei.
Thank you so much, Maria, for a very enthusiastic introduction. Very, I appreciate it. I wish I were there in person, but eventually, I guess it would be possible. So today I will talk about the acoustic variation in Kalasha laterals, and a little bit more actually about palatalization that Maria mentioned. Sound change through contrast, enhancement, and language contrast. Just to make sure everybody can hear me okay? Yeah, okay. Good. So, well, first of all, I would like to say that this is a study in collaboration with Jan Hegard Peterson from the University of Copenhagen and Paul Arsenault, Tyndale University College in Toronto. And I should say also that Jan is the person who's the actual field worker and expert on Kalasha. And Paul, my former PhD student, who's been doing extensive language documentation work in South Asia. I should also acknowledge contributions of various individuals, including Ida Elizabeth Morsch, who together with Jan did field work and funding from Danish government as well as Canadian government to fulfill this research. And what I will be presenting today is the study that was published recently in the Journal of Acoustical Society of America. And so it has benefited from feedback of anonymous reviewers and the editor, Ben Tucker. I will start with an overview of what lateral approximants are. So I'm not sure how many phoneticians are in the audience, but hopefully this will bring everybody in. So lateral approximants, or just L sounds, right? L-type sounds. And typically languages based on cross-linguistic surveys tend to have just a single dental or alveolar L. It's the majority of languages have one. And for instance, like we have in English, like French has, like Mandarin Chinese has. These can vary from depending on the position. For instance, in English, L tends to be somewhat different in onset position before vowels than in coda position, word final position, for instance. In the word final position, it's often velarized, and in some varieties of Australian English, it's particularly salient, while in onset position, it's the opposite. It tends to be somewhat palatalized. But this is a single phoneme, right? And that's the case in many languages. Now, there are languages, and there are fewer of those that have two-way contrasts or three-way contrasts in laterals. That is when an alveolar or dental L is also in contrast with phonemic contrast with a palatalized lateral or palatal or retroflex lateral. So here we are interested in two-way contrasts in laterals. And here I will give a couple of examples of more common types. One of them is secondary articulation contrast. So here we have an example from Russian between a velarized L and palatalized L. So it would be something like Allah, Allah. And what we see here is that, well, they have the same primary place of articulation. The tongue tip is at the alveolar ridge, at the teeth and alveolar ridge, right? So it's pretty much the same, but they differ drastically in the shape of the tongue. So for the velarized one, we have the back of the tongue. The dorsum is retracted towards the uvula, the pharyngeal wall. So technically speaking, it's actually not velarized, but uvularized or pharyngalized sound, while the palatalized one has some bunching of the tongue. The tongue body is raised and fronted, and the entire tongue is actually fronted. So they're quite different, create a very salient contrast. Another type of contrast is retroflexion. And here languages have a plain dental or alveolar sound, L sound, contrasting with the retroflex sound, where the tongue tip is curled behind the alveolar ridge towards the palate. And this is an example from Kannada. So here the difference is in the primary place of articulation, right? You may also notice that the plain L is actually somewhat similar, at least for these speakers, to the Russian palatalized L. There's some kind of raising of the tongue body. So this is articulation. If we look at the acoustics, the first contrast, secondary articulation contrast, is primarily distinguished by second formant. Second formant. That is, the velarized consonant is characterized by low second formant during the closure, while the palatalized one is characterized by high F2. And that's because of differences in how the vocal tract is structured given the constrictions. So we have two cavities, for instance, here, here, and here. In this case, we have one large cavity. I won't go into the details of that, but that's how we arrive at these differences. Now, the retroflex, non-retroflex contrast is characterized not by F2, but F3, third formant. And retroflexes tend to have low F3, and that's due to the front cavity right here, sublingual cavity. And here we have essentially the lack of this cavity, and it's very small, so we have medium or high F3. So these are two types. And what we are interested here is what kind of type is observed in Kalasha, or perhaps there is some kind of variation. Kalasha is, okay, just a second, I'll move everybody's profiles aside. So we are interested in laterals in Kalasha, which is a Northwestern Indo-Aryan language, a group that is also often referred to as Dardic. It's a very small community, about 5,000 speakers, that the language is spoken on the border with Afghanistan, Chitral district, northern Pakistan. And so here are the locations. There are essentially just 4 villages where Kalasha speakers currently live. Now, Kalasha is interesting phonologically and phonetically in a number of respects, but one of the characteristics is the robust retroflexion contrast. So here I have an inventory of consonants and vowels of Kalasha, so it's a fairly large inventory, and you can see that there's a robust correlation in retroflexion. So there are dentals, alveolars, retroflexes, alveolar palatals among coronal consonants, but a lot of retroflex is more than, say, normally we observe in Indo-Aryan languages. There are also vowels that can be classified as retroflex or rhotic, and they can combine be combined with nasalization as well. Now, lateral sounds, however, are not part of this contrast somehow, which is unexpected. So if we have a contrast in retroflexion, if we have 2 laterals, usually the default in a language in South Asia, you would have a retroflex lateral as well. So here we have a secondary articulation contrast in terms of palatalization and velarization, and they are produced in the denti-alveolar region. And this is just based on our recent observations, but we will talk about that it's not as straightforward. So here we have some near minimal pairs with the contrast. And just for a second, because I can't play it in PowerPoint, I will play these pairs in prod.
Lop, low, lop, low.
So that's word initial position, 2 laterals. And the second one is
well, 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 well.
So I hope you could hear the difference, and it's fairly salient difference. I don't know to what extent it's salient. Thank you, Maria. To native speakers of English, to native speaker of Russian, it's sounds to me very close to what I would hear in Russian, but I would say that this is a fairly may not, as we will see, this may not be the the pronunciation that is typical of all the speakers. And it's a fairly, well, read pronunciation that is somewhat exaggerated. Okay, so why is it an interesting question? So it looks like there's a clear contrast there, but the story is more complicated. There are conflicting descriptive accounts. So early documentation of Kalasha, which was done at the end of the 19th century, few short descriptions with Morgenstierne's study being more extensive. He did considerable amount of research in the area. All of them present Kalasha as having a single lateral. Now, more recent work by Traylon Cooper and from Macquarie University and Morgan Hegard identified 2 laterals, and that can be classified as dark and clear, corresponding sort of to what we observe in English in syllable initial, syllable final, and syllable initial position, or velarized and palatalized. And Hegard and Morsch actually did some palatographic investigation. And if not everybody is familiar, this is basically a fieldwork technique that allows us to determine the place of articulation of consonants by painting the tongue with charcoal and oil and then asking the speaker to produce the sound and then immediately insert a mirror into it. And what we can see here, we can see this is the L, velarized L. Obviously we cannot see velarization here, but we can see that it's the primary articulation is just at the teeth or slightly behind the teeth. and it's very small area, which would be typical of velarized L. The other one has a more extensive contact, and it's slightly further back, so they classified it as alveolar, palatalized alveolar, and that seems to be right. It could be also alveolar palatal. We can't see further behind the alveolar ridge here. So, but what they also noted that these sounds are highly variable, and sometimes it was hard for the researchers to actually identify which sound was produced. They had to consult the dictionary, they had to check with others, and that's an interesting observation, which is conflicts with my own observation of recordings that I did with more recently. Now there's also another account that posits 3 laterals, including a retroflex one. So this is, it is not clear where this is coming, though the dialect described is apparently the same dialect. So there's some inconsistency there, perhaps reflecting variation in the community. There are also uncertain historical sources of these patterns. If well, one may wonder why do we have 2 laterals here in Kalasha if Old Indo-Aryan was posited to have just a single lateral? And looking at a few etymological correspondences from Sanskrit, for instance, we see that both of them actually go back to Old Indo-Aryan single L. Sometimes also the velarized L developed from dentals T and D, but there's no clear pattern when and how this happened. Finally, if we look at the languages of the area, also this is somewhat surprising. Red dots here represent languages in South Asia that have retroflexes, retroflex laterals. Now Kalasha is right here. There is a bunch of languages, white dots, which means there's just a single lateral. There is one language here that has palatalized laterals, but this is a different pattern, Kashmiri. It has all consonants having palatalized and non-palatalized counterparts due to morphophonemic alternations. And then there is another language, Howar. We'll talk more about it, actually described recently as having velarized L as well as plain L. So this will be relevant later on. Overall, there are several kind of interesting questions why we want to study this. Well, these 2 laterals are unexpected given what we have in the inventory of the language, unexpected largely given what we have in other languages of the area. There are conflicting descriptive accounts as well as historical sources of the patterns are not very clear. So that's why we are turning to the question, well, if we do a more systematic investigation, do we actually observe secondary articulations, or perhaps this is a retroflexion pattern, at least in under some conditions. Now, and it's interesting that velarization and retroflexion, they sometimes go hand in hand in phonology, at least. These consonants tend to pattern with respect to certain assimilation processes and distribution phonotactics. So turning to the study, the methods. So we had a number of recordings spanning from recordings done from 1997 to more recently to 1217, that is 20 years, 20 years. The number of speakers, mostly males, some females, and they were recorded in, they were from mostly the same locations, mostly from Bumburet Valley, Kraka as the biggest village there. Most of the recordings were done in Pakistan. Some were done in Greece with speakers who migrated there. And a lot of this work was done by Jan Hegard Pettersson and with assistance of his collaborators there in Pakistan. And I was only involved in the last piece, which was the easiest, from Greece. This is a fairly variable sample given what we have in terms of age, occupation, from village elders, shepherds, to interpreters, educators, housewives. In terms of education, some speakers don't have any education, some have a university degree, as well as you can see age differences are also considerable. But this makes the sample interesting. So we want to see whether there is any within sample variation there. Some of this, some of the data came from a word list, but the majority came from continuous speech. Some stories, and some of which have been published by Haggard Peterson. Numbers of tokens. So we wanted to try to balance this more or less between the samples, which is obviously not possible, but we have a fairly large representation, relatively speaking. The annotation was done in Prot, as we would normally see. Laterals tend to have lower intensity, and we can identify where the vowel ends, the lateral begins, and then the vowel begins again. That's oftentimes it's straightforward, but not all the time. And we are looking here at formants F1, F2, F3. These are red dots there corresponding to formants. We are interested in F2 and F3 as corresponding to secondary articulations or retroflexion. We measured extracted values at the midpoint of the lateral and analyzed using the following statistical analysis. So we had F2 as a correlate of palatal velarization, F3 as a correlate of retroflexion. These were normalized by speaker. I can tell you more about that later. Fixed effects were, we looked at consonants, right? So maybe useful to refer to the table here. We have two consonants in two positions, onset and coda, and next to vowels, front vowels, central vowels, and back vowels. So these are the main factors. Now, we also had different recording sets. We kind of wanted to take that into consideration. That was a separate analysis, recording, gender, education, and so forth. And speaker, random factors were speaker and word. Now, turning to the results, and I will present them starting with F3, normalized F3 across the sample. Then we'll talk about F2, right, palatalization, velarization, and then we'll talk about within sample differences, some variation due to demographic factors. So these are three main pieces. So starting with the F3, so kind of to make it sure that, well, to answer the first question, do we actually have evidence of retroflexion here? So what we will see, the plot here on the right is normalized values for F3. So if you look at the scale here, 0.5, it was normalized so that 0.5 is the maximum retroflex value you would get, the lowest F3. 1.5 is the maximum non-retroflex value, something that we would get with, for instance, vowel E. Then we have context next to front vowel, next to central vowel, next to back vowel, and then at the bottom we have whether it's velarized L phonemically or a palatalized L phonemically, right? And we are looking at, so these horizontal lines are the median values for the entire set of speakers, all the speakers combined, and then we have kind of variation, 50% of the variation, and then 75 and 75 on the other end, right? So hope everybody can follow what we see here. First of all, the statistical results analysis showed that there is a significant effect of consonant, that consonants are different from each other in terms of F3. And that is overall, as we can see, F3 is higher for the palatalized than for the velarized, right? However, we can also see that neither of those consonants can be classified as retroflex, perhaps except for a few outliers here, because they are median values are well above the borderline between retroflexion and non-retroflexion. Otherwise, if we had a retroflex L, we would found values somewhere in this area. So this kind of settles the first question. Although there are some differences, there is no retroflexion apparently in the sample. Now, what about palatalization, velarization? And here the same type of presentation, the same kind of plot, F2. 0.5 means this is the maximum velarization as we would get with vowel U, for instance. 1.5 is the maximum palatalization as we would get with vowel E. What we see here is that there is again a significant effect of consonant, and palatalized consonants, palatalized L has considerably higher F2 than the velarized one. And this is again, one is the borderline between palatalization and velarization. And we can see that, yeah, they are on average in those two different areas. So this is velarized, this is palatalized. Now, but we should say that this is actually moderate palatalization and moderate velarization, because if it was extreme palatalization, we would have values mostly here around 1.5, and velarization values would be here. As well as if we compare it to languages such as Russian, for instance, this is a lot more moderate realization of the contrast. Now, there was also a significant effect of vowel, right? So whether the consonant is next to front vowels or back vowels, there is a big difference. And we can see particularly for the velarized L. And that's why we also get the consonant vowel significant interaction. You can see that if next to front vowels, laterals overall have higher F2, and particularly the velarized L is affected. Now, this vowel effect is expected. This is something because some kind of co-articulatory assimilatory process. Now, turning to perhaps more interesting results and somewhat unexpected, at least from my own perspective. So what happens if we look at speakers within across speaker variation within the sample? Demographic factors. So what we have here in the plot on the right is actually, I plotted all the tokens for each individual. And the individuals are arranged by their birth estimated date, a year of birth, starting from 40s and going to late 80s. Right, so these are all the tokens, and then we have palatalized realizations, velarized realization, that is based on sort of the intended realization based on the dictionary, at least. You can see that there are some that don't pattern as expected. But overall, looking at these factors, so we ran all these factors, age, gender, education, recording set, none of those were significant on their own. So none of them were significant on their own. There was no significant effect. But when we look at interactions of consonant with each of those, they turned out to be significant. And this is because if we look at L, there's something happening. The velarized L has fairly high values approaching 1, which is no velarization. This is no velarization. This is the borderline. So it's fairly close for older speakers, but velarization has increased considerably for younger speakers. There's a little bit decrease, a little of a decrease for palatalized L as well. This was not significant. So the interaction are coming from the velarized L. And this is not just age, but also we found that females tended to velarize more than males. More educated as well as younger males tended to have more velarizations than older males, as well as in the task, we compared, for instance, read speech, single words compared to spontaneous, continuous speech. There are also differences there. There's more velarization when a participant is asked to read words, as the ones that I played before actually have very clear velarization. So there are some differences here that were not expected, and I will talk more about this in discussion. But for now, to summarize, so all three plots that I showed you earlier in the results. So the first one showed that there is no retroflexion, although there are some differences in F3, which may be coming from something else, from the shape of the tongue, the types of the constriction for each lateral. The second part, we found moderate velarization and palatalization, although relatively speaking, they were quite robust, and particularly next to non-front vowels. Next to vowel A, next to vowels O and U. They were quite, the contrast was clear. And finally, we found also some demographic-based differences. Age, gender, education were the factors. Now, it's certainly, I should mention that it's difficult to tease those factors apart because the way our sample was structured, the older speakers also are less educated speakers. The oldest group were the males. So it's hard to tease those apart just based on the data. But this is, I think, a good starting point for further investigations. So to turn to the discussion, first, our question was whether the language has palatalization, velarization contrast, or retroflexion contrast, or perhaps a variation depending on the condition or speaker group. Well, looking at the sample altogether, we can say that, well, it's secondary articulation contrast, which is, confirms the results of most extensive recent investigations by Trail and Cooper, by Morgan Haggard, and shows that, well, at least in our sample, we don't see any evidence, clear evidence of retroflexion. Now, it would be interesting actually to compare these two laterals to retroflex vowels or to vowels of Kalasha in general. Plain, as I mentioned earlier, this is one of the very few languages that has a contrast between has a contrast between plain and retroflex or rhotic vowels, and not just a single vowel, but a full set. So here's, this is from Journal of IPA, illustration of Kalasha, the vowels here, kind of a typical vowel plot, F1 by F2. So we have this is the low high dimension, this is the front back dimension. So we can see that this is E, A, and U, and here roticized or retroflex E, A, R, or that are somewhat centralized, right? But they are primarily distinguished by F3. As we can see here, there's a plot F3 and F2. And we can see that retroflex vowels, they are all patterned in very low F3 frequencies, right? So they are all quite distinct. Now, where do the laterals fall in if we plot them? Now, laterals are not vowels, but they're characterized by the same kinds of formants during the closure. So we can plot them here. This is for the same speaker. And we can see that the two laterals actually fall nicely on the front back dimension, right? So the palatalized L, it's not as palatal as E, but it's going there. And the velarized L is not as velarized backed as U or O, but it's, yeah, this is where the difference is coming on the F2 dimension. And if we look at retroflexion, neither of them actually patterns with retroflex vowels. They are just here on the plain vowels. So this kind of confirms further that, yeah, we are on the right track, seems like, with respect to this particular question. And that was the initial question that kind of motivated us to investigate this further. But what turned out to be, there is some variation that we, at least, were not as aware of, or some researchers like Jan Hegard was aware of some variation, but was not sure where it was coming and how it is structured. So we saw that variation seems to be conditioned by age, gender, education. Now, taking age as the primary factor here, we could take Labov's apparent time hypothesis and try to apply it to our case. So what Labov proposed is that speakers' language patterns, they tend to reflect the state of the language at the time of their adolescence. And after that, it kind of fossilizes. Certainly, this is a simplification. We know now that, I mean, our sound patterns continuously in flux, but largely this is sort of true, appears to be true. And so if this is the case, then we would say that our older speakers, those who were born in between 1946 and 1952, perhaps reflect the state of the language before 1970s. And this is, in fact, the time when the Kalasha community was fairly isolated. There was not a lot of interaction with the outside world. And there has been drastic development in the 70s. Cultural development, there's some of the communities switched, well, some of the communities more further away, they switched to local, another local language, Hovar, as well as which came together with the switch, switch to different religion, Islam. Now, perhaps this sound change, there was this sound change that was going together with this cultural sociolinguistic situation in the community. If this is the case, this is certainly a speculation at this point, but then perhaps what we see here is the contrast originally was not between velarized and palatalized, but rather between plain and palatalized, if we kind of extend this line further. So there was a contrast, but it was not as robust, and it was not involving velarization, just palatalization. Now, velarization has increased considerably more recently, if our interpretation is correct. Now, this would actually explain, so here I kind of outlined the change as how it could have happened. If this is in fact the case, this would explain some of the discrepancies in previous accounts. Recall that the first documentation efforts of Kalasha descriptions didn't contain just a single lateral, and that could be because the contrast existed, but it was not salient enough to outside researchers, and especially given that this is not a contrast that is typical of the languages of the area. It also explains the high variability, as researchers noted, early fieldwork researchers who worked within the community, they noted that it's sometimes really hard to distinguish these sounds. And now my recordings that came from the speakers who were in Greece, actually, there was a very salient velarization there. So I was surprised to hear actually that in earlier recordings, Jan, for instance, had difficulty identifying those sounds. But when I listened to his fieldwork recordings, I could see that for older speakers, indeed, it was not easy to distinguish particularly next to front vowels. So apparently there is some kind of change. Then the question is, why did this change happen? Again, this is very speculative, but why do changes like this happen? Well, oftentimes there's kind of internal factor. If you have a phonemic contrast that is not well auditorily distinct, languages tend to evolve to enhance it, right? And that's what has happened in Russian and many other languages, for instance, Slavic languages with palatalized and velarized L. Velarization was developed, in fact, to enhance the contrast with palatalization in Russian. We've seen examples of enhancement in laterals in languages like Malayalam. Portuguese also has, whenever you have a contrast between two laterals, you would tend to make those more different. And perhaps this was the trigger for the change. But there is another possibility, or perhaps a contributing factor, is that, as I mentioned earlier, there is a language Howar that is spoken in the area. And in fact, in the last 50 years or so, it has become a lingua franca of Chitral. So it's kind of, if you go out from the Kalasha community, the first language you would have to speak is Howar. And the language has velarization. The younger speakers, the younger male speakers, they are all fluent in Howar because they had to leave the community. They had to go, for instance, and go into college. You would have to go and sometimes go into high school as well. That's also would involve speaking Howar, and that is likely the case. Now, the female, this, however, does not explain why our female speakers have considerable velarization, despite the fact that they did not report to speak Howar. So perhaps what we are dealing here is an interaction of the two factors. That change was introduced in the community and it picked up in the direction and proceeded in the direction of the more dominant language of the area. Now, it would be interesting then to compare Kalasha laterals to those of Howar. And this is not an attempt to do any systematic studies. This is a very preliminary comparison. What we simply did is Journal of IPA is an excellent journal that has illustrations, language illustrations that come with sound files. What you could do, you can listen to those sounds and you can also analyze them. So we have two recent publications. One is from Howar, one is from Punjabi, that has sound files. So simply we just compared values for laterals in these two languages. So Howar has velarized L and plain L. That's how they are described. Punjabi has retroflex L and plain L. And so here's our Kalasha laterals for the youngest male speakers we have. And what we see here is that comparing just these two values, so velarized Kalasha L and velarized Howar L, they are close. Velarization in Kalasha, these are non-normalized values. Velarization in Kalasha is not to the same extent as in Howar, but it's fairly close. And if we look at Punjabi, this is F3, whether Kalasha has retroflexion or not. Well, clearly it doesn't. We can see very high F3 value compared to very low F3 value for Punjabi. Now, this is very preliminary, and there's probably a lot more to this, but I'll leave it at this. This tentatively confirms that, yeah, perhaps the influence of Howar is an actual influence that we observed. certainly more work needs to be done on the languages of the area. And I should also mention that, well, here we confirmed that the language has this contrast, velarization, palatalization, and also we have confirmed found some variation. Here, we certainly could not answer all the questions that I posed earlier. Where did the contrast come from? How it developed historically, as well as how it developed in Hovar, which seems to be sort of occurring in somewhat different set of lexical items than in Kalasha. So these are interesting questions that still need to be answered. But stepping aside from this, sort of thinking about where we are going, I'm personally interested in kind of looking at a variation in lateral systems, lateral contrasts across Eurasia. And what you see here on the map is kind of two kinds of patterns. So here, one is a more broadly, we are not looking just palatalization, velarization, but contrast that is distinguished acoustically by F2 primarily, high or low F2. And that involves palatals, palatalized consonants versus alveolar, just plain alveolar, or velarized dentals alveolars. So the blue color here indicates the languages of Eurasia that have this type of contrast. And this is based on the Foible database. The red color indicates the languages that have retroflex type of laterals, plain and retroflex. And we can see that these two very rarely overlap. So the blue area is largely in southern Western Europe, a large part of the northern Eurasia, while red retroflexion is something that we knew in South Asia, as well as there's a couple of languages, Swedish and Norwegian, that do have retroflexion as well. So it is interesting that these are essentially in complementary distribution. So why does this happen? Why do languages prefer to go one way or another? These could be historical factors, could be something else, some kind of acoustic salience differences, need to maximize contrast in a certain way, or the types of language inventories that we have, which is certainly the case for Indian subcontinent. There is only one case of language reported to have both in Eurasia, and that's a Finno-Ugric language here, Munsi. But yeah, it is interesting why this doesn't happen as frequently. Now, Australia presents a unique example where this is the norm in Australian Aboriginal languages. So this is would be interesting kind of to compare why this is not a constraint of any type in Australian languages, why it is such a major constraint in languages of Eurasia. So the general question then to go forward is looking at these lateral systems. We are interested in learning about how languages actually develop those contrasts, how they maintain them, perhaps through enhancement, and if they can't enhance, how they merge those lateral contrasts. How does the sound change proceed involving laterals? Thank you.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Alexei. Lovely.
Thank you.
Lots there to talk about. I don't know. I haven't got any questions in the chat. So maybe, okay, David's written something. He said, my understanding is that Kalasha is an endangered language. Younger speakers may be dedicated enthusiasts. Is it possible that through their enthusiasm to preserve the language, these young speakers are emphasising a contrast that for older speakers is not so salient?
Yes, that's an excellent question. Yes, two of the speakers I dealt with in particular, those who tended to emphasize the contrast. That's clearly, perhaps unintentionally. Two of them are language enthusiasts. One has been involved in creating school programs, went actually back a few times from Greece to teach Kalasha. Yeah, they are enthusiasts of the language, and this is a factor indeed. It is interesting that even for at least one of the speakers, we had continuous speech recordings, where like a story recording as well as reading a word list. In the word list, we found there's this exaggeration, while in the story this was not noticed as well. But still, even in the continuous speech, there was more velarization than for all the speakers. So apparently there's difference as well. And some of the speakers were younger male speakers were recorded in Pakistan by Jan. They also exhibit contrast, despite them not being involved in these activities.
Alexei, what you're saying is echoing something that we came up with in our JASA paper earlier this year it was a Foreman study of the apical alveolar retroflex contrast in 3 Central Australian languages. And we certainly couldn't help coming to the conclusion that literacy in the language helps maintain the contrast in terms of Foreman measures. So this is coming at exactly what you're saying. It's coming through, as you say, better in reading word lists than in connected speech. And you know, I noticed that a politician, for example, who was used to speaking the language in a public context, she maintained that contrast jolly well, you know. So, okay, so Brett's written something. Oh, just before I read Brett's question, I'll also say to you, Alexei, that one thing that was coming through as well in the EPG data from Aranda, retroflexion and laterality are not very compatible. So we saw the center of gravity moves forward for the retroflex, for the lateral, as compared to the top or the nasal. And we explained that by saying that, you know, the requirement for lateral airflow is not compatible with a tongue tip retraction gesture. It might make it just difficult. Yeah, just might make it that little bit more difficult to allow laterality. So by bringing the tongue forward, it might be easier to elongate the tongue to allow the lateral airflow. So that's from memory, it's a JFON paper, EPG data.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, looking at center of gravity. It was coming through very clearly that again, the contrast is not so strong for laterals as it is for nasals and stops.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'll read. I've got a couple of questions here. I can talk a bit more about that later. But so Brett's question is, and then we've got a question from James. And at any point, I can pause the recording for questions. That's all right too. Or if anyone wants to unmute themselves and say, you know, we'll just pause it, whatever. But Brett wrote, he's just had an article accepted where they argue that the change to "ly" in Rhode Island, using the contrast dispersion argument you mentioned. I don't know of any other examples like that. Oh, except retroflexing to pre-palatal and Arandic. Yeah, we've got this issue as well in Arandic. So,
sorry, what is the issue?
What?
The issue with Aranda?
Oh, there is historical stuff. You're putting me on the spot here, but
oh no, I thought that was part of the question. No,
part of the question was retroflexes becoming palatals, and the argument there normally isn't it about the proximity of F2 and F3, and that F2 and F3 are relatively close together in the lower frequency range for retroflexes, and still relatively close together, but in the higher frequency range for palatals. So it's to do with the proximity.
I see.
That was the argument. That was what I was told. You know, well, as a hypothesis.
Yeah, that could potentially be sort of a part of the initial change that occurred. Yeah.
Yeah. So some of that confusion.
Thank
and
you.
then James's question was about internally motivated changes. Why didn't the change take place earlier?
Sorry, why did the change?
Why didn't the change take place earlier? Which is a fair enough question.
Yes, so actually, I mean, that's what historical linguists would ask, and that's a difficult question, yeah. Why did the language exist for, who knows, maybe centuries with a fairly small contrast? Yeah, I don't have an answer to this. It is interesting, though, it has been reported that in languages in small communities, right? So there are some phonemic patterns tend to survive that are fairly unusual. So in a small, closely knit community, perhaps these speakers tend to get attuned to them. But once there's an interaction with the outside community begins, perhaps these contrasts would need to be enhanced given the bilingualism.
That sounds like a sensible explanation to me. James, does that, sorry, I've interrupted you, Alexei, but does that make sense? That a small community doesn't need to have... Okay,
I was typing response, but I'll just, hi. Yeah, if you look at Peter Treadgill's book on sociolinguistic typology, that's his argument, is that more complex systems tend to be maintained in smaller, more tightly knit communities, and then communities that are more widespread. And he presents a bunch of case studies that suggest that this is the case. And he's got a new book out that I have called Millennia of Language Change, where he also brings this up in terms of historical linguistics as well. So that's always my question, though, is when you talk about internal motivation for changes, like why? So they seem to have been quite happy with this already for quite a period of time. So why then did it suddenly change? And that's a case where I think that you could argue that this dispersion or contrast might be the reason, the linguistic reason for it, but then there must be some sort of probably language external thing that triggered that. I mean, the other possibility is what Labov talks about in his, principles of language changes, this idea of forks in the road. You've got a situation where something can go in one of two directions, and there typically is some aspect of the contextual environment that leads it to go in one way or the other. So he talks about it, for example, the shifts going on in North American English, where with the cot-cot merger happening in a bunch of different dialects, but it has different results in Canada and the Western United States than it does in the middle part of the United States because of other stuff that's happening there. So that because of the context in which it's occurring. So I don't know whether you could argue that something similar might be going on here. That might be the contrast. I mean, one thing I noticed with regard to some of the post-vocalic laterals is that the vowel quality was different. So it may be the case that maybe the contrast is increasing because of things that are happening with the vowel system. I don't know.
Yeah. There's definitely vowels get backed before it. These are very important points, James. Thank you. I realize I do need to talk more to sociolinguists.
They've thought about this. Stephen's just written, he's going to leave, or may have left by now, but he's still there. He says he remembers from studying Pali that at least one explanation of the retroflex laterals in that language is that they arise as allophones of voiced retroflex stops in intervocalic position. So according to Wikipedia, which is, be all and end all on, these kinds of topics. But he says he can't remember the reference. So
yeah, I do remember this being said. I just can't remember where, and presumably someone has said it. I don't know if this is a possible reason why in some of the languages that have a retroflex contrast today, that this is not found in Sanskrit. That's all I was thinking about when you made that point.
Is it a proper lateral, Stephen, or is it a retroflex flat? A retroflex flat.
Pali is not a spoken language, right? So it's a pre-Medi. I mean, it's an ancient version of Sanskrit used for the Buddhist scriptures. It's 2,000 plus years old. So I don't think we have very good phonetic descriptions.
Okay, so it could be anything. Okay.
but it does claim this distinction, and this distinction is then represented by separate consonants in multiple languages that write Pali. So it comes from somewhere. But I don't know how useful this observation is.
No, it shows that, sort of those contrasts arise, and arose in some Indo-Aryan languages. Yeah.
Anyway, I have to go. Thank you very much. And
thank you, Stephen. Thank you for organizing it.
You'll remind people about next week's seminar.
Oh, it's me. Yep, yes. I'm talking to. I'm actually talking at University of Toronto on Saturday, and because Stephen cancelled his seminar next week, I said I would give a repeat of my talk at University of Toronto in this seminar series. So same time next week. I'm talking about Kharkhet, a language of Papua New Guinea. So, okay. All right. So if people need to be leaving now, I might just put